All right, so what are we going to be doing in this course? William James, who wrote the best psychology textbook besides Gleitman, great American philosopher, pioneering American psychologist, defined psychology as the science of mental life. The whole point of psychology is to describe the nature and function of mental structures and processes, the mental structures and processes that underlie human experience, thought, and action. Psychology is the science of mental life. It tries to understand how the mind works. What do we mean by mental life? Well, no better description of what the mind does exists, I think, than the one offered by German philosopher Immanuel Kant more than 200 years ago. He said there are three things that the mind does. It knows things, it feels things, and it desires things. There are three absolutely irreducible faculties of mind: knowledge, feeling, and desire. Great 20th century psychologist Ernest Hilgard, Jack Hilgard, put it another way. He talked about what he called the trilogy of mind, of cognition, having to do with knowing things and believing things, emotion, having to do with feelings, affects, moods, and motivation, having to do with needs and goals and purposes, drives, desires, all of that kind of stuff. So what psychology tries to understand is how we engage in these kinds of mental activities, how we know things, where feelings come from, what's the nature of motivation, and so on. So the scope of psychology is very broad, and so is the scope of this course. We will focus mostly on basic mental processes, try to figure out how the mind works, and in this course, because we don't have an unlimited amount of time, we're going to focus mostly on basic cognitive processes, how we get knowledge and acquire knowledge and use knowledge. In addition, psychology is interested in things like where the mind comes from. So we're going to be talking about developmental psychology for a little while, how mind arose through biological evolution, how mind changes through the development of the individual. For a lot of the course, we'll be talking about mind in general, how perception and memory and thinking and reasoning work in general. But psychology is also interested in individual differences, in how each individual is unique with respect to the organization of his or her mental life. We all have somewhat different beliefs, somewhat different desires, somewhat different reactions to what goes on around us. These individual differences in mental life are a very important aspect of what psychology is all about. Towards the end of the semester, we'll talk about pathology of mental life, so-called psychopathology, what the various disorders of mind look like, schizophrenia, depression, anxiety disorders, whatever those various mental illnesses are. And then finally, in addition to being a basic science, psychology is an applied science. We're not just interested in how the mind works in the abstract. Psychologists are interested in taking what we know about how the mind works and applying this knowledge in various domains. To education, to help the process of teaching and learning be as good as it can be. In psychotherapy, for the prevention and treatment of various forms of mental illness. In the workplace, to help managers be more effective, to help workers be more productive. Psychology, as a science of mental life, is both a basic science that tries to understand how the mind works, and an applied science that seeks to make that knowledge useful in various ways. So what kind of science is psychology? Well, psychology is first and foremost what we call a behavioral science. There are a number of these behavioral sciences, like anthropology and economics and political science and sociology, each of which has a somewhat different approach to understanding the behavior of the individual organism, whether that's a human organism or an animal organism, as the individual interacts with other individuals and with the surrounding environment. That's all the behavioral sciences are interested in that. But each of these behavioral sciences takes a somewhat different approach to understanding behavior. And in psychology, what we're particularly interested in is the mental processes that lead people to behave the way they do. The basic rationale for psychology as a science is to be found in a philosophical doctrine known as mentalism, or sometimes known as mental causation, which, stated formally, basically says that mental states are to action as cause to effect. That is, the individual's mental states cause him or her to do the things that he or she does. Because, okay, you behave the way you do because you think or feel or desire the things that you do. So, for example, consider a fairly dramatic example behavior. A person commits suicide. Question is, why did somebody do that? Why did he or she behave in that particular way? Psychological explanation always explains behavior in terms of the individual's mental states. So, for example, we could give a cognitive explanation for this behavior in terms of what the individual knew, or what the individual believes. So perhaps this person committed suicide because he believed he was of no value. Or we could give an emotional explanation of that individual's behavior in terms of his or her emotions, affects, moods, or feelings. So perhaps a person committed suicide because he or she felt depressed. Feelings, not knowing, not believing, a feeling explaining behavior. Or might give a motivational explanation for that individual's behavior in terms of his or her drives, needs, goals, or so on, so that perhaps the person committed suicide because he no longer had the desire to live. Psychological explanations of behavior are always in terms of knowledge, feeling, or desire. Always in terms of the individual's cognitive, emotional, or motivational states. So when we try to think about what kind of science psychology is, you find out pretty quickly that psychology is a social science. And the reason for that is all behavioral sciences try to understand the behavior of the individual, but the individual lives in a social environment. We are social beings. We live in a world of other people with whom we interact, we cooperate, we compete with these individuals. So psychology, as a social science, tries to understand the relation between the individual and the social world in which he or she lives. So you'll find psychologists looking at various aspects of social interaction, how we interact with each other for cooperation and competition, how we understand other people, how groups and organizations influence the behavior of the individual. Personality and individual differences also usually thought of as part of psychology as a social science. So psychology is a social science, and it's also a biological science. Just as psychology is a social science because because humans are social creatures, psychology is a biological science because we understand that the brain is the physical basis of mind. And so, if you want to understand how the mind works, you probably ought to understand a little bit about how the brain works. So, in this course, we'll do a little bit of neuroanatomy, a little neurophysiology. We'll talk a little bit about how the nervous system relates to other bodily systems like the endocrine system and the immune system. Molecular and cellular biology, as you'll see, is also relevant to psychology. Genetics, evolutionary biology, also relevant to psychology. But finally, ecology, which looks at the relation between organisms and the environment, is also something that psychologists have interest in, especially the relationship between the individual and the social environment. So psychology is a social science, it's also a biological science. In some sense, it's also a physical science, because the brain is a physico-chemical system. It operates according to basically electrochemical principles, and one of the most important new tools for psychology are a set of devices that allow us to, in various ways, image the brain, take pictures of the brain while people are engaged in mental activities. So because the brain is the physical basis of mind, and the brain is an electrochemical system, psychology also counts to some extent as a physical science. The fact that psychology can be thought of as a biological, maybe a physical science in some respects, raises the question of reductionism. It's one of my favorite quotes from Ernest Rutherford, typical attitude on the part of people like him. There's only one science, that's physics. All the rest is stamp collecting. Never mind that Rutherford himself won the Nobel Prize in chemistry. He seemed to have had some self-hate there. But there is a tendency among some scientists to think that if you really got a science, you ought to be able to reduce the principles of psychology to principles of biology, and principles of biology in turn to principles of physics. And one of the underlying questions in psychology, one that you might grapple with in your discussion sections, is whether that can actually happen or not. To what extent can we reduce the principles of psychology to the principles of particles operating in fields of force? My own view is that that's not the right way to do psychology. Rather, I prefer that you think of there being different levels at which we can explain various aspects of behavior. There is the psychological level of explanation in terms of the individual underlying mental states, cognitive, emotional, and motivational states. However, you can also give a sociocultural explanation of behavior of the kind favored by economists and sociologists and anthropologists that explains behavior of the individual in terms of sociocultural structures and practices, what's going on in the society that the person's a member of, what's going on in the culture that the person's a member of. Or you can give an explanation behavior in biophysical terms, in terms of things like neurotransmitters, genes, and hormones. These are all related to each other in some ways, but what I want you to think of, the view I want you to think about in this class is that each of these levels is a legitimate explanation of behavior in its own right. Okay? Physical explanation or a biological explanation of behavior is no better than a psychological explanation of behavior. It's just a different kind of explanation. Psychologists explain behavior in terms of the individual's mental states. And as I say, other sciences might do it differently. So, for example, we could explain behavior psychologically in terms of the individual's knowledge, feelings, and desires, or we could give an explanation of that same behavior in terms of something sociocultural, that he was in a group and his leader told him to do it. Whether you're a Japanese kamikaze pilot in World War II or a member of the Jonestown cult in Guyana just about 20 years ago, the explanation of those suicides is to be found in the cultural surround of the individual. Or you could give a biophysical explanation by thinking, well, maybe there's some genetic predisposition to suicide, and that accounts for why somebody does it. These different levels of explanation are all of equal status. In psychology, we favor the psychological level of explanation in terms of knowledge, feeling, and desire. Okay? So think about psychology standing in the center of things, okay, connecting down to the biophysical level of explanation, because the brain is the physical basis of mind, and connecting up to the sociocultural level of explanation, because the individual is embedded in a wider social context. In the end, psychology connects up with lots of different fields of inquiry. Psychology shares with philosophy and theology and literature and art fundamental questions about the nature of human existence and how the individual's experience is shared with others. Psychology shares with economics and sociology and history and anthropology a concern with the relations of individuals to society. It shares with biology and physiology and physical anthropology the relation between the individual and other creatures, and it shares with physics and chemistry and cosmology an interest in the place of the individual in the universe as a whole. These other fields of inquiry, physics, chemistry, biology, sociology, anthropology, study the world outside the individual, whether it's the physical world or the social world. Psychology studies what Morton Hunt once called the universe within the individual, the universe that exists within the individual mind. We'll begin talking about all of these things and more on Wednesday when we begin to look at the brain as the physical basis of the mind. Thank you very much.